So what does it mean when you're playing the best elf commander that actually isn't an elf? Well, that means you're playing Voja, Jaws of the Conclave, one of the promo cards that came in the pre-release kits for Murs at Karlov Manor. Voja here is a 5/5 wolf with trample, vigilance, and ward 3 that says when it attacks, you get a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control equal to the number of elves you control, and you get to draw a card for each wolf you control. So what can we do with that? Well, let's start off with some elves that are above the normal bland elves, boring elves that you usually see in a mono green elf deck, since we can branch out into other colors. Now, speaking of the boring elves, let's get those guys out of the way, and we'll talk about the ones that you would see pretty much in any and all elf decks, no matter what color combination you're going to put together. Things like Beast Whisperer, Elvish Archdruid, Elvish Mystic, Elvish Warmaster, Llanowar Elves, Paradise Druid, Priest of Titania, Reclamation Sage, Lisa Lana Huntmaster, Evolution Sage, Leaf Crown Visionary, Wirewood Chandler, Imperious Perfect, and Galadrim Brigade. We're not going to go into these too heavily, but these are your meat and potatoes elves of the deck, making a bunch of mana or giving us utility while putting more elves on the board or being Lord's cards to pump them up, that sort of thing. So instead, we're going to focus more on some elves that are not really used a lot because they don't match the color requirement that we need for most elf decks. So let's take a look at some of those cards now. First, we'll dip into a couple cards from the Lord of the Rings expansion. First up is Aragorn and Arwen Wed for 4, a green and a white. You get a 3/6 human elf noble with vigilance that says whenever it attacks or enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature you control. You gain 1 life for each other creature you control. So this go ahead and gives us kind of a redundancy / backup plan if Voja keeps getting killed, by giving us something else that can put counters on our elves and on all of our other creatures to kind of spread things out. It also becomes a way for us to regain big chunks of life when we need to, like if we're getting beat up. So as with many of the cards in this deck, the more creatures you have, the better this card will be. The other Lord of the Rings card that I was talking about here is Arwen, Weaver of Hope. For 1 green, you get a 2/1 elf noble. Each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters on it equal to Arwen's toughness. So the good thing here is this actually scales up with Voja's trigger ability. Aside from the fact that Voja is going to boost all of our elves, if Arwen's on the board when this happens, all of our future creatures hitting the board, including a recast of Voja that when she gets killed, will enter much larger due to the Arwen's ETB trigger scaling with every counter that she gets. And even at a lower power, she's still really strong and a great play here with all the +1/+1 counter synergies. Now, if you want an elf that's kind of really out there because of the color combinations and doesn't see a ton of play, let's take a look at Baloth Baratil Entertainer. For 4 and a red, you get a 2/5 elf shaman. Creatures your opponents control with power less than Baloth's power are goaded, and whenever a goaded attacking or blocking creature dies, you create a treasure token. And it has choose a background, but that doesn't do anything for us because it's not going to our commander. So like Arwen, Baloth Baratil actually scales up with every counter it gains, allowing us to goad bigger and bigger creatures as the game progresses, opening up lanes to pummel your opponents, as well as just making the rest of them beat the crap out of each other before your elves just go ahead and wash over them in the end. And surprise, surprise, another good elf here that is actually mono red, Delina Wildmage for 3 and a red, 3/2 elf shaman that when it attacks, choose a target creature you control, then roll a d20. Rolling 1 through 14 creates a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of that creature, except for it's not legendary and has to exile this creature at the end of combat. And then if you roll a 15 through 20, create one of those tokens and then roll again. So if you high roll over and over and over again, you get multiple copies off of this. And there's a lot of functionality here that we can get out of this deck by copying some of our stuff, regardless if they're legendary or not. So like, you copy a bunch of Wreck Sages, blow up a bunch of stuff on your opponent's side of the board. Or maybe you want one of your legends to kind of push their abilities up and go further. So you can copy a legend and it's going to get multiple copies. Or just, plain Lord's cards to pump our elves up and give us a little bit of an overrun style effect. The possibilities are actually really endless trying to use this to copy things in the deck. Let's take a look at one of the very few mono white elves that have been printed in Magic with Rumor Gatherer. For 1 white, it's a 2/1 elf wizard with Alliance. It says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1, and if it's the second time this ability has resolved this turn, draw a card instead. So this will give us a nice bit of card selection and draw if we can generate at least 2 creatures each turn, which with an elf deck, that shouldn't be too much of an ask. Next up is a card that I really wish I could make work more often, and that is Fleetfoot Dancer. For 1, a red, a green, and a white, you get a 4/4 elf druid with trample, lifelink, and haste. I love cards that have keyword soup on them like this, and this thing is going to run your opponents over very quickly, as well as gives you a nice burst of life, since Voja is going to be bulking this thing up and making it nice and chonky really fast. Then we'll move to a card that I have not used in a very long time, but it fits here perfectly and scales nicely with what Voja is doing, and that is Tana the Blood Sower. For 2, a red, and a green, you get a 2/2 elf druid with trample. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, create that many 1/1 green sapperling creature tokens, and it has partner, which we don't care about here because it's, again, not a commander. So as I said, this scales up very nicely with Voja, because as we dump counters on this, it's going to get big enough to just trample over just about anything our opponents have going on. And if any of that damage gets across, you get that many sapperlings, giving us even more bodies to add to counters later on in the game. And since we have so many token generating spells and creatures in the deck, I couldn't resist including Reese the Redeemed for a long game. For a hybrid Selesnya, you get a 1/1 elf warrior that has 2 and a hybrid Selesnya tap, create a 1/1 green and white elf warrior token, and pay 4 and double Selesnya and tap. For each creature token you control, create a token that's a copy of that creature. So if you haven't already overwhelmed your opposition, or you just need to recover from a board wipe or something of that nature, Reese can come down, help refill the board, and then just with a few tokens, Voja can supersize those guys, and you'll be right back to beating your opponents down. And speaking of the token generation in this deck, we're going to go ahead and add some cards here that can give us some good amounts of tokens, whether it's in a burst or in a long, drawn-out way. First up is Wolverine Riders. For 4 green. It's a 4/4 elf warrior that says at the beginning of each upkeep, create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. Whenever another elf enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life equal to its toughness. So the great part here is it acts kind of like a verdant forest, where it gives us an elf every upkeep, including your opponents, and kind of slowly builds our army up. So within 1 turn cycle, you're going to have 4 new elves coming up, along with this one, counting as the 5th if you just played it for the first time. And then every time those enter, you're gaining a life. So you're going to gain a minimum of 4 life per cycle, and that's not counting any other elves you've put into play. So we are also going to talk about the burstier types of this with something like Galadrim Ambush. For 3 and a green, it's an instant that says create X 1/1 green elf warrior creature tokens, where X is the number of attacking creatures. And then it also has prevent all combat damage that we dealt by non-elves this turn. So this has a bit of a double effect for us, where we get to create all these elf warriors, but then we also get to prevent the combat damage. So if somebody kind of sneaks in something like a death touch clause getting added on to something, or they activated something to grant death touch, whatever happens to be the case, you can go ahead and slam this, and you're going to stop them. As long as that creature they're blocking with isn't an elf, it's not going to deal with damage, and you're still going to run them over. Now, the only bad part about this is it also stops Voja from dealing damage because she's a wolf. But sometimes you just have to do it just to force the extra tokens onto the board and to just smash your opponents in the long game. And just like the Galadrim Ambush, we also have Elven Ambush. 3 and a green instant. When you cast it, you create X 1/1 elf warrior creature tokens equal to the number of elves you control. The only thing is, this is just slightly different than the Galadrim Ambush. This one does not require you to be attacking or have your opponents be attacking you, unlike the Galadrim Ambush, which requires an attacking set of creatures to get the tokens off of it. So you also lose the fog effect, or the elf fog, whatever you want to call it, off of the other card. So there's different approaches to using both cards, but both of them are really good. One's a good thing to have for the combat trickery, but the other one you can cast at the end of your opponent's turn to have those elves up and ready for when you come up. And then the last big burst of elves that we can get here is Windswift Slice. For 2 and a green. It's an instant that says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. Create a number of 1/1 green elf warrior tokens that's equal to the excess damage dealt this way. So if you are using Voja and you're building up your elves to be really big, and then you Windswift Slice and smash like a 1/1 with like a 12/12, you'll get 11 more elf tokens off of this. And it's just going to build more bodies for you to put counters on off of Voja's attack trigger. and it's just going to cause a big snowballing effect, and eventually the deck's going to run free and out of control. Voja has another tack-on effect for her attack, and it doesn't matter about elves, it matters about the other side, which is wolves. So what does that involve for us? Well, that means we're going to have to play some wolves in here as well, because this thing actually let's draw cards off of the wolves that we control. Now, sadly, there are not a ton of wolves that are amazing for us to use. Most wolves in Magic actually kind of suck, if not just being kind of mediocre. So for the most part, we're going to have to rely on wolf token generators and a few of the decent wolves that we have at our disposal to take advantage of the card draw trigger part of Voja. So let's start with the actual wolves that are in the deck with Cemetery Prowler. For 1 green, it's a 3/4 wolf with vigilance. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, exile a card from a graveyard. Spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each card type they share with the cards exiled by the Prowler. So we get a little bit of graveyard hate attached to this. We go ahead and, cheapen up our spells for everything that it goes and eats, because you're going to eat multiple things with this, and it's going to get big and harder to kill in the long run. So you're going to be able to exile multiple things off of this. So it's really nice here because it gives us a decent sized body, and it helps us just in the grand scheme of things while being a decent wolf to gain cards off of. We'll also go to its 3-mana Brethren from Innistrad, Primal Adversary. For 2 and a green, it's a 4/3 wolf with trample that says when it enters the battlefield, you can pay 1 and a green any number of times. When you pay the cost 1 or more times, you put that many +1/+1 counters on the Primal Adversary, and then up to that many land you control become 3/3 wolf creatures with haste that are still lands. So you can have the ability to generate, 2 or 3 extra wolves if you need to. Just bear in mind, it's usually not the best plan in the world to make your lands vulnerable to board wipes and other types of removal that they wouldn't normally be vulnerable to. So in this case, it's kind of a user beware type situation. But if you really need the cards or whatever, I wouldn't be adverse to, putting down at least 1 land, and then that way you can draw 2 off of a Voja trigger. And then our third and final actual wolf in the deck is Wandering Wolf. For 1 and a green, you get a 2/1 wolf that says creatures with power less than Wandering Wolf's power can't block it. So this is sort of a self-contained champion of Lambholt, where instead of giving all your creatures the ability to punch through, it gives this thing itself the ability to be able to punch through, because the bigger it gets, the harder it is to block, and eventually it's just going to outscale in size with Voja's +1/+1 counter trigger, and your opponents are not going to be able to block it at all. So since we don't have access to a bunch of, actual wolf cards that are good, what else can we do about the shortage of wolves in the deck? Well, let's take a look at things that generate tokens of wolves, such as Wolfbriar Elemental. For 2 green, 4/4 elemental with multi-kicker of a green, which means you can pay that any number of times when you cast the spell. And when it enters the battlefield, you get a 2/2 green wolf creature token for each time that it was kicked. So it's basically, as long as you have a bunch of green mana laying around or the ability to generate a bunch of green mana, you can kick this a bunch of times and get a bunch of wolves off of it, and then you swing with Voja and refill your hand really quickly. But if you have time, we have a little bit of a blend of the 2 creature types that we care about in this deck with Wren's Run Packmaster. For 3 and a green, 5/5 elf warrior. Champion an elf. When it enters, you have to sacrifice it unless you exile another elf you control. And when this creature leaves the battlefield, that card returns to the battlefield. You can pay 2 and a green to create a 2/2 green wolf creature token. All your wolves have Death Touch. So this gives us a kind of a Wolf Lord card where you get to grant them Death Touch, but then you also have the ability to dump 3 mana into it, as long as you have that available, to generate wolf tokens every single turn. And then another card that does really well with our wolves is Tulsamir, Friend to Wolves. For 2 green, white. You get a 3/3 elf scout that says when it enters the battlefield, create Voja Friend to Elves, a 3/3 green and white wolf creature token, and whenever a wolf enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 3 life, and that creature fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. So what does this actually do for us? Well, it gives us basically a fight mechanic, and it also gets us a big burst of life if we need it. So say you multi-kick a Wolfbriar Elemental for 6 times or something like that, you're going to gain 6 times 3, that's 18 life. And those 6 wolves can then start fighting, and you can either burn down 1 really big creature with the wolves, or you can take out a bunch of little stuff to clear the road for your other bigger stuff. And then we'll also include the new Tulsamir, the Midnight's Light. For 2 green, white. You get a 3/2 elf scout with lifelink that when it enters the battlefield, create a Voja Fenstalker token, which is a 5/5 green and white wolf creature token with trample. And it says whenever a wolf you control attacks, if Tolsimir also attacked this combat, target creature an opponent controls blocks that wolf this combat if able. So this works really nicely with the Ren's Run Packmaster because you're going to create wolf tokens, you're going to have wolves, and then when you attack with Tolsimir, you're going to force your opponents into really bad blocks because then those wolves would have Death Touch off of the Packmaster. Or sometimes you can just, create a bad block and they have to basically have the wolf eat their stuff. So there's a lot of good things going on here with this Tolsimir, and I can't wait to give it a try in the deck. Now, aside from all the elves and the wolves that we're adding to this deck to really make it pop, let's look at some special packages as I'm including in this deck. I got a pair of them that I wanted to point out. The first package is a set of cards that grant extra combats for us. Voja's trigger will go off for each combat, so as long as we were netting, 2 or 3 attacks per turn, things are going to get out of control really fast for our opponents. So the first one, and probably the best one we're going to include here, is Aggravated Assault. For 2 and a red enchantment, pay 3 red, untap all creatures you control. If it's the main phase, there's an additional combat phase, followed by an additional main phase, activate only as a sorcery. So what does all that tangled mess mean? It means during your second main phase after you've attacked, you're going to untap your stuff and be able to attack again. And if you have 5 more mana, you can do it again. Now, you can do this in an infinite loop. There's lots of ways to do it if you wish to do so. I did not set it up in this deck to be able to do that. So if you want to do that and have your friends hate you for doing it, be my guest. If you're looking for something a little less repeatable and a little more table friendly in terms of not getting everybody to hate you right off the bat, let's take a look at Savage Beating. For 3 red, it's an instant cast only during your turn and only during combat. Choose 1. Creatures you control gain double strike until end of turn, or untap all creatures you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase, and you can choose both options if you pay the additional 1 and a red Entwine cost. So for a total of 4 and triple red, you get to give all your stuff double strike and get an additional combat phase after that. So there's great things that you can do with this, and it's just going to finish the game off most likely if this goes off with a board full of stuff, especially when they're getting so big with all the +1/+1 counters going around. If you wanted to use a newer card that does the attack extras, let's take a look at Ansrag the Quake Mole. For 2 red-green, you get an 8/4 Mole God that says when it becomes blocked, untap each creature you control. And after this combat phase, there will be an additional combat phase, and you can pay 3 red, green, and force them to block it as combat if able. So if you're able to make this indestructible or make it big enough to survive any combat with Voja, then you're going to get basically infinite attacks because eventually they're going to have to block this thing anyways and be able to just generate multiple combats off of it. And then eventually their stuff's just going to die and you're going to run them over. So all in all, it's a win-win for you. And the last card of this package is not really an extra combat, but is an extra turn that results you either winning or losing. And that's Chance for Glory. For 1 red, it's an instant. Creatures you control gain indestructible. Take an extra turn after this one. At the beginning of that turn's end step, you lose the game. So what does this do for us? Well, it gives us a couple of things. 1, you can swing in and then you can give all your stuff indestructible to make sure it survives that combat. And then it'll give you the extra turn on the next thing. And then you can swing again and try to finish them off. This is really good if you need just that little extra push and you're out of ways to give extra combats or whatever. You can force an extra turn into this and then be able to take over and win on the spot, or lose if you can't. And then the second package is a pair of I Win cards should you ever draw them. The first card I'm bringing up is Shalai and Halar. For 1, a red, a green, and a white, you get a 3/3 Elf Angel with Flying and Vigilance. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, Shalai and Halar deal that much damage to target opponent. Because of how powerful the interaction of Shalai and Halar with Voja piling on counters is, I did not include any kind of tutoring or effects to make this, not become the go-to win con in the deck. You may be inclined to not even include this card at all with how powerful it can be with this particular commander. But as I said earlier, copying some of our legends to get more out of their abilities with Delina would ensure mass destruction of your opponents, with even a modest amount of elves on the board to generate enough counters to have Shalai and Halar just burn them out of the game. And the other I Win card that if you drop this on the board, you're probably going to win on the spot is Sigarda's Summons. For 4 white, it's an enchantment. Creatures you control with a +1/+1 counter on them have a base power and toughness of 4/4. have flying and are angels in addition to their other types. I have been trying for a very long time to find a place for this card in so many decks and in so many formats. And here, I think I finally found a good spot for it here. On the surface, it does not seem like a big deal, but in a deck that dishes out so many +1/+1 counters, it's a cheap version of a Moonshaker Cavalry or a Craterhoof Behemoth, where you can grant flight in this case, and as long as it sticks around, you're going to be netting this damage boost by giving all the little 1/1 elves up to a 4/4 starting body. Then the counters come piling on, and they're just going to run your opponents over, because flying is not as common as you would think, so it's pretty easy for these creatures to hop on over and finish your opponent off once this hit the board. No need to spend the extra money on a Moonshaker, or you get a Craterhoof to trample over instead. So those are the heaviest hitters I wanted to include in this deck. The rest of the deck is mostly just ramp, rocks, removal, and protection spells, and you can find all of the rest of that information down in the description below with the deck list. If you like what's going on here, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help the channel grow and gets it out into the algorithm. And as always, thank you for watching and have a great day.